Seraphina always remembered her grandmother's last words, whispered on a deathbed years ago. "Keep to the ridge, child. Don't never go down to the forbidden cove. What's buried there, let it lie." For years, she honored that promise, serving the community of Hemlock's Notch as their herbalist, their yarb doctor, a bridge to the old ways. But when a strange coughing fever sweeps the holler, her remedies are useless. Fear turns to panic, and panic needs a scapegoat. The elder, a man who always distrusted her grandmother's knowledge, points a trembling finger. "It's witchery," he cries. "She brought this curse on us." Branded a witch, Seraphina is given an ultimatum: stop the sickness or face the consequences. She realizes the fever and the cove are connected. Her grandmother wasn't just warning her, she was hiding something. The secret that cost her grandmother her life is now Seraphina's only hope of saving her own. Tell me in the comments what city you're watching this story from. I'd love to know how far these exciting stories are reaching. And if you've ever experienced an inexplicable situation, share. Seraphina always remembered her grandmother's last words, whispered on a deathbed years ago. The old woman's hand, gnarled as the root of a mountain oak, had gripped hers with a surprising dry strength. "Keep to the ridge, child," Elspeth had rasped, her eyes fixed not on Seraphina, but on the window, as if watching a storm gather over the peaks. "Don't never go down to the forbidden cove. What's buried there, let it lie." For years, Seraphina honored that promise. It was an easy promise to keep. The community of Hemlock's Notch, a tiny cluster of cabins pressed into a narrow valley, had its own laws, written in folklore and fear. The forbidden cove was at the center of that fear. It was a place spoken of in whispers, a place where the sun was said to never touch the ground, and where the water ran dark and sour. She had inherited Elspeth's role, as Elspeth had inherited it before her. Seraphina was the quote-quote yarb doctor. She was the one they called when a fever broke, when a child's cough turned ragged, or when a man gashed his leg with a poorly swung axe. Her cabin, nestled at the edge of the settlement against the slope of the ridge, smelled of drying ginseng, mullein, and pine resin. She was a part of the holler, a bridge to the old ways, a comfort. That comfort shattered in the late autumn of 1883. It came not with the wind, but with a cough. It began with Silas Croft the trapper. He returned from a long journey into the high peaks and complained of a shadow in his lungs. He described it as a feeling of wet leaves, cold and heavy, that no amount of coughing could clear. Seraphina brewed him her strongest lungwort and comfrey tea. He was dead in a week. Then his wife Mary fell ill, then the baker, Mr. Hemlock. The sickness was a phantom. It respected no boundaries of age or strength. It settled deep in the chest, a wet, rattling sound that filled the small cabins. The first sign was the cough. The second was a fever that left the skin pale and clammy. The final stage was the silence, when the patient, exhausted from the fight, simply stopped breathing. Seraphina worked without sleep. Her hands, usually so steady, were stained dark with herbs. She tried every remedy her grandmother had taught her. She boiled pine sap poultices to draw the sickness from the chest. She brewed teas of wild cherry bark and elderberry. She burned sulfur bundles to clear the air. Nothing worked. Her remedies were useless. She would sit by a bedside, the air in the small cabin thick with the smell of wood smoke and sickness, and watch the life drain from a face she had known since childhood. She watched as hope in the eyes of the family turned to a dull, familiar despair, and then that despair began to curdle. Fear, she knew, needs a scapegoat, and panic needs a target. It found one in her. The first whispers were as insidious as the fog that crept up the valley. Her grandmother would have known what to do. Elspeth's remedies always worked. Then the whispers grew bolder. Maybe her remedies are the cause. She's been spending more time on the ridge gathering. What? The accusation finally found its voice in Elder Gideon, a man whose piety was as hard and unyielding as the mountain granite. His own son, Thomas, lay shivering with the fever. Gideon had always distrusted Seraphina's knowledge, seeing it as a relic of a pagan past that his dog-eared Bible should have long since scoured from the mountains. He stood in the muddy track that served as the town's center, his beard quivering, and pointed a trembling finger at Seraphina as she carried a useless bundle of herbs. "It's witchery," he cried, his voice cracking with a mix of grief and fervor. The half-dozen settlers who had gathered to share their misery turned as one. "She brought this curse on us. Her grandmother trafficked with shadows, and now the daughter brings us death. She's poisoning us." The accusation hung in the cold, damp air. It was a death sentence. In this isolated holler, trapped by geography and superstition, the elder's word was law. The faces that had once looked at her with gratitude now hardened with suspicion. The men who had once tipped their hats now clutched their coats, as if to ward off a chill or an evil. Branded a witch, Seraphina was given an ultimatum. Elder Gideon, standing before her small cabin, the crowd a silent, menacing jury behind him, laid down the terms. "Stop the sickness, witch. Prove you serve God and not the devil. You have until the new moon, 3 days, or we will cleanse this holler of your poison, as the good book commands." The door to her cabin slammed shut, the heavy oak bar falling into place. But it wasn't the town she was shutting out, it was the town that had shut her out. She was alone, utterly. The silence of the cabin was deafening, broken only by the ragged sound of her own breathing and the memory of the elder's threat. Cleanse this holler. She knew what that meant. Fire, the rope, or a long walk into the frozen wilderness with nothing but the clothes on her back. She slumped onto her stool, the bundles of useless herbs spilling from her lap. She had failed them. No, that wasn't right. Her knowledge had failed. Everything her grandmother had taught her, every root, every leaf, every prayer, it was all as useless as ash. She looked at her hands, stained and calloused. She had tried to save them, and for that, they would kill her. A cold dread, sharper than the autumn air, settled over her. The new moon, 3 days. She couldn't find a cure in 3 days, when she hadn't found one in 3 weeks. The situation was hopeless. She was trapped. Her eyes drifted to the small, worn chest where her grandmother kept her journals. Not the ones she shared, the recipes for poultices and tinctures, but the private ones, bound in cracked leather. She had never dared to open them. "Some knowledge is a burden, child," Elspeth had warned, "best left buried." Now the elder's words echoed. Curse, witchery, and her grandmother's, "Keep to the ridge. Don't never go down to the forbidden cove. What's buried there? Let it lie." What if they were connected? What if the sickness wasn't a sickness at all, but the curse the elder spoke of? What if her grandmother, in her wisdom, knew that the forbidden cove held the source, or the cure? The thought struck her with the force of a physical blow. Her grandmother wasn't just warning her, she was hiding something. She looked at the barred door, then at the small window. The sun was setting, painting the high peaks in hues of blood and bruised purple. The holler was preparing for another night of fear, another night of listening to the rattling coughs echo from the cabins. Seraphina stood up. The fear didn't leave, but a new, cold resolve settled alongside it. The town had given her an ultimatum. They had called her a witch and condemned her, but they had also, in their ignorance, given her the key. She was a healer. She had been taught to fight death, not to surrender to it. If the holler had cast her out, then she was no longer bound by its rules. She was no longer bound by her grandmother's promise. The secret that cost her grandmother her life, or her reputation, was now Seraphina's only hope of saving her own. She would not wait for the mob to return in 3 days. She would go tonight. She would go to the forbidden cove. To wait for total darkness was to invite madness. Every creak of her cabin, every gust of wind that rattled the chimney, sounded like the first stone being thrown, the first torch being lit. Seraphina did not wait. She gathered not herbs, but tools. A small hand pick, her sharpest skinning knife, and a coil of rope. She packed a small satchel with the last of her journey bread, a water skin, and after a moment's hesitation, her grandmother's locked leather journal. She did not take a lantern. Where she was going, she could not risk being seen. She unbarred the back window, a small opening just large enough to crawl through. She dropped into the damp, cold mud behind her cabin, the smell of rotting leaves and wet earth filling her nostrils. The holler was to her left, a collection of weak, yellow lights against the oppressive dark. She turned right, climbing the ridge, her feet finding the familiar path in the gloom. The promise, keep to the ridge, had been her grandmother's law, and for Seraphina, the ridge was a sanctuary. It was where she gathered her supplies, where she could breathe air that wasn't thick with the holler's fear. But tonight, the ridge was just a road. She walked for an hour, the moon a pale broken sliver behind a shroud of clouds. The wind was high, a thin wailing sound that covered the noise of her movements. She reached the place Elspeth had always warned her away from, the hunter's trap, a deep, sudden cleft in the mountainside that marked the only entrance to the forbidden cove. To stand at the precipice was to understand the name. It was not a gentle slope, it was a fall. A narrow, treacherous goat path wound down into blackness. It looked less like a path and more like a scar. She checked the rope, cinched her satchel, and took her first step down. The descent was a nightmare of loose scree and grasping thorns. The air grew colder, heavier. The sound of the wind on the ridge died, replaced by an unsettling, profound silence. It felt as if the mountainside itself was holding its breath. The path was slick with a strange dark moss she didn't recognize, a moss that seemed to drink the meager moonlight. Twice her boots slipped, sending a cascade of small stones clattering into the darkness below. She froze, her heart hammering, listening. But the only sound that returned was the echo and the distant, unsettling trickle of water. After what felt like an eternity, her feet touched level ground. She was in the cove. She stood still, letting her eyes adjust. It was a place built from shadows. The trees, ancient twisted hemlocks and black pines, grew so densely that their branches knitted together overhead, forming a canopy that choked the sky. The moon was gone. The air was thick, with the smell of damp stone, decay, and something else. Something sharp, almost metallic. The ground beneath her feet was not soil, but a carpet of dark, coppery red needles. And the silence, it was absolute. No crickets, no owls, no nightlife. It was a dead place. What's buried there? Let it lie. Her grandmother's warning echoed in her mind, and for a moment, a primal fear seized her. This place was evil. The elder was right. She should run. But then, the cough. She heard it, not in the cove, but in her memory. The sound of Mary Croft's son, Silas, his small body struggling for air, the sound of her failure. No, I am here for a reason. She moved forward, her hands outstretched, feeling her way through the oppressive dark. The ground was uneven, knotted with roots as thick as a man's arm. She followed the only sound, the faint, sickly trickle of water. She found the stream. She knelt at its edge, dipping her fingers in. The water was frigid. She brought her fingers to her nose. It had no smell. But, as she drew her hand back, she saw it, even in the deep gloom. A faint, oily, reddish-brown residue coated her skin. She wiped it on her trousers, a shiver of revulsion running up her spine. This was the black water of the legends. She followed the stream deeper into the cove, into the heart of the darkness. The gorge narrowed, the stone walls rising sheer on either side, and then she saw it. A light. Not a fire, not a lantern. It was a pale, sickly, greenish-white glow. It pulsed faintly, like a dying heart, from a cluster of something growing at the base of the rock wall, right where the stream emerged from the stone. She approached, her knife in her hand. It was a fungus, a huge, pale, web-like mushroom clinging to the damp rock. It was the source of the glow. And all around it, the dark, copper-red needles were thicker, piled as if in offering. But it wasn't the fungus that held her, it was what was next to it. Half buried in the needles, tucked into a small, dry crevice in the rock, was a wooden box. It was small, wrapped in oilcloth, and secured with a leather strap. It was her grandmother's. She recognized the tooling on the leather, a simple, repeating pattern of a ginseng leaf. This was no accidental discovery. This was a cache. Her grandmother hadn't just warned her away. She had been coming here. Seraphina's hands trembled as she pulled the box free. The leather strap was stiff, but it finally gave way. Inside, there was no journal, no confession. There was only a single, small glass vial, stoppered with wax, containing a dark, almost black liquid. And beside it, a bundle of dried, unfamiliar herbs. They were not from the ridge. They were herbs that smelled of metal and shadow. This was the discovery. This was the secret. Her grandmother wasn't a witch. She wasn't a victim of the cove. She was a scientist. She had been studying this place. But what had she found? A poison or a cure? Seraphina clutched the vial, her mind racing. The elder said she had 3 days. She now had a single, terrifying clue: the water from the stream, the glowing fungus. And this mysterious, dark liquid. A sudden sound, a rock tumbling from the path high above, shattered her thoughts. "I see her, down there." A light flared at the top of the gorge. A lantern, 2 men, silhouetted against the sky. They hadn't waited for the new moon. The elder had sent his hounds. Seraphina grabbed the box, plunged the vial and herbs into her satchel, and scrambled into the deeper darkness of the gorge, the metallic smell growing stronger. She didn't know if she was running from the mob or running toward the answer. She only knew, with chilling certainty, that they were one and the same. The discovery was not an answer. It was a new, more dangerous question. The men's voices echoed down the gorge, distorted and monstrous. "Spread out! She can't have gone far." The lantern beam swung wildly, a single, terrifying eye searching the darkness. Seraphina didn't run. She vanished. Years of walking silently on the ridge, of knowing how to place her feet to avoid snapping a twig, now served her life. She pressed herself into a cleft between 2 great stones, pulling her satchel close. She held her breath, her body as still as the rock itself. The metallic, coppery smell was thick in her lungs, almost choking. The men, Hiram and Jeb, 2 of Elder Gideon's most devout followers, blundered down the path. Their heavy boots slipped on the same moss that had nearly claimed her. "This place is cursed," Hiram, Jeb muttered, his voice tight with fear. The lantern beam illuminated his pale, sweaty face. "I can feel it. The air's poison." "The elder said she's the poison," Hiram retorted, though his own voice wavered. He shined the lantern beam around the clearing, the light sliding over the glowing fungus. "What in God's name?" "It's the witch's light," Jeb hissed, backing away. "She's conjuring." "She's just a girl, you fool. Now find her." Hiram swept the light towards Seraphina's hiding place. She pressed herself deeper, the rough stone biting into her back. The beam passed directly over her, a hair's breadth from her face, and then moved on. "Nothing here but shadows and stink," Hiram grumbled. "She must have doubled back. Come on, let's check the stream path." They moved past her, their lantern a receding yellow spark. Seraphina waited, counting to 500, her heart a trapped bird against her ribs. Only when their voices were completely gone, swallowed by the oppressive silence of the cove, did she allow herself to breathe. She was trapped. She couldn't go back up the path. They would be waiting, or they would see her. She had only one direction, forward, deeper into the cove, following the dark, metallic stream. She began a new life in that moment, a life of shadows, secrecy, and desperate, frantic work. The holler knew her as the witch, the outcast, the harlot who had fled. But the truth was, she was their only hope. Her new routine was a torment. By day, or what she perceived as day, the slight lessening of the gloom as some pinpricks of light filtered through the canopy, she hid. She found a deeper cave, a dry hollow behind a curtain of ancient roots, where she established a cold, desperate camp. She ate her journey bread crumb by crumb, rationing it. She drank the cove's water, the oily, dark water, convinced it was the only way to understand it. It tasted like a wet stone, like old pennies. And she studied. She unlocked her grandmother's journal with the edge of her skinning knife. And the world changed. It was not a diary, it was a ledger, a scientific record written in Elspeth's tight, precise hand. Her grandmother, far from being a simple yarb doctor, had been a brilliant, self-taught naturalist. And for decades, she had been secretly studying the cove. Elspeth's notes were meticulous. She had mapped the cove. She had identified the fungus, Lucernia pallida, pale light. She'd named it. She'd cataloged the strange copper-red moss. She'd analyzed the water. And she had found the source of the curse. "It is not a curse," Seraphina read, her fingers tracing the words by the dim glow of the fungus she had brought into her cave. "It is the earth. The spring that feeds this stream runs through a deep vein of lodestone and copper. The water is heavy with it. The black color is oxidized mineral." Her grandmother wrote of the animals, how none lived in the cove, how the trees, though ancient, were stunted and twisted. The soil was toxic. "This place is poison," Elspeth had written. "But in poison there is often a key. Nature balances." Then Seraphina found the entries about the sickness. It was not new. Her grandmother described an identical outbreak 40 years prior, in 1843. The same cough, the same shadow on the lungs, the same deaths. The holler blamed a traveling preacher, called it God's wrath, Elspeth wrote. They were wrong. It came after the long drought, when the main spring ran low and the men blasted for a new well near the ridge. They must have breached the wall. They let the cove's water into our own. Seraphina's blood ran cold. It was happening again. They were living through the same nightmare. The sickness wasn't a curse. It was poisoning, copper poisoning, slow, insidious, building in their lungs. And the cure? She turned the page. The vial, the herbs, the moss, Elspeth wrote. The sphagnum obscurus. It filters. It drinks the metal. It holds the poison. But the root is something else. Her grandmother described a complex process. How she would burn the copper-heavy moss to an ash. How she would mix that ash with a tincture from the glowing fungus, which had powerful, unknown properties. And how she would use the dark, oily liquid from the vial, a concentrated bile from the root of a plant that only grew in that poisoned soil, to bind it. It was not a simple cure. It was an antidote. This was her new routine. By night, she became a ghost. She crept from her cave, avoiding Hiram's and Jeb's sporadic, fearful patrols. She gathered the copper moss. She scraped samples of the fungus. She dug for the deep, black roots. By day, she worked in her cold, dim cave. She built a small, smokeless fire using dry tinder and her flint, tending it meticulously. She ground. She boiled. She distilled. She was covered in dirt, her hands raw and stained black, her eyes burning from the strange fumes. She was no longer a yarb doctor. She was an alchemist, working in a subterranean hell. She made the antidote, following her grandmother's recipe. It was the black liquid from the vial. It smelled of ozone and wet metal. She tested it on herself. She took a single drop, her hand shaking. The taste was vile, burning and cold. For a moment she thought she had made a fatal error. A wave of dizziness washed over her, but then it passed. She felt clearer, the fog in her own head, the one she hadn't even noticed, the one that must have come from drinking the cove's water. It was lifting. It worked. Now, she had to get it to the holler. She was a witch. She was a hunted animal. She couldn't walk into Elder Gideon's cabin and hand him a vial of black liquid. Her new routine had one final, desperate component. She had to become the very thing they accused her of. She had to become a shadow. She had to find a way to deliver the cure, unseen, to a town that wanted her dead. And the clock was ticking. The coughs from the holler, which she could hear carried on the wind at night, were growing weaker. The silence between them was growing longer. The new moon arrived, and with it, a new, colder fear. The 3 days had passed. Seraphina, from her high, hidden perch, had watched the holler. She saw no mob. She saw no torches. What she saw was worse. She saw a funeral. A small, pathetic procession of 3 people. Hiram, his wife, and the elder, carrying a small pine box. It was Silas, Mary Croft's son. He hadn't survived. The silence from the town was not the silence of forgetting. It was the silence of mourning and of a hatred that was past the point of shouting. They didn't come for her because they were too busy burying their dead. This changed everything. Her plan to sneak into the village, to secretly dose the well or leave vials on doorsteps, was the plan of a girl. It was too slow. The poison was accelerating. The main spring, low from the autumn drought, must have been drawing almost entirely from the contaminated cove source now. They were drinking it every day. She had the cure, a precious, finite amount, in a large glass jar, but it was useless in her hands. She had to face them. She had to bring the antidote and the truth was a thing more dangerous than the poison. She packed her satchel. She left the cave, her grandmother's journal strapped to her back. She did not climb the treacherous goat path. She followed the stream. She followed the poison to its source. She found it. Behind a curtain of dead vines, a collapsed tunnel. It was an old mining exploratory shaft, just as Elspeth's journal had suggested. This was the breach. This was the wound in the mountain. And it was her only way in. She crawled into the blackness, the jar of antidote clutched to her chest. The tunnel was tight, claustrophobic, the air thick with the smell of metal and dead earth. She crawled on her hands and knees for what felt like miles, her only guide the cold, wet stone beneath her. She emerged, not into the holler, but into a root cellar. She smelled apples and potatoes. She recognized it instantly. It was the cellar beneath the meeting house, the one that doubled as the church, where Elder Gideon held his sway. She had emerged in the belly of the beast. She climbed the steps, her body aching, her hands raw. She pushed open the heavy trap door. The meeting house was not empty. It was filled with the sick. The pews had been turned into cots. It was a makeshift hospital, dim and smelling of vinegar and death. In the center of the room, on a pallet, lay Thomas, the elder's son. He was barely breathing. His mother, Miriam, wept silently beside him, wringing a rag in a bowl of useless, cloudy water. Elder Gideon himself stood at the pulpit, his Bible open. But he wasn't reading. He was just staring, his face a mask of gray, broken despair. When Seraphina emerged from the floor, covered in black mud, her hair matted, clutching a jar of dark liquid, Miriam screamed. It was not a scream of fear. It was a scream of pure, unadulterated hatred. "The witch! She's come to finish us!" Gideon's head snapped up. The despair in his eyes vanished, replaced by a terrible, righteous fire. "Demon!" he roared, grabbing a heavy wooden candlestick from the altar. "You dare bring your curse into the house of God?" "It is not a curse." Seraphina's voice was a raw croak, but it cut through the room. "It is the water!" "Lies!" Gideon advanced on her. "You poisoned them with your herbs, and now you come to gloat." "She's here!" Miriam shrieked, pointing at the jar. "She's brought the devil's own brew!" The conflict was here, not in the cove, not on the ridge, but in this room, with the dying. This was the true trial. "Look at him, Gideon!" Seraphina shouted, desperation making her bold. She pointed not at the elder, but at his son. "Look at his lips. They are pale. Look at his fingernails. There's a blue line. It's not the fever flush." Gideon faltered, his eyes darting to his son. "I have been to the cove," Seraphina said, her voice dropping, forcing them to lean in. "I have read my grandmother's notes." "Elspeth," Gideon spat, "the root of the poison." "She found the poison, Gideon, 40 years ago, the same sickness. It's in the water. The drought has lowered the spring, and the mine shaft near the ridge. It's breached the cove. We are drinking the poison from the forbidden cove." It was a truth too large, too terrible. To accept it meant their entire world, their superstitions, their fear of the cove, was a lie. And that Gideon himself, by forbidding them from ever investigating the cove, was responsible for their ignorance. "Blasphemy," he roared, though a sliver of doubt had entered his eyes. "You would blame the earth, blame God for your own sin?" "This is the antidote," Seraphina said, holding up the black jar. "My grandmother made it. I have made it again." "It is poison," Miriam cried, shielding her son's body. "She'll kill him." "He is already dying, Miriam." Seraphina's voice broke, tears of frustration and grief streaming down her muddy face. "You all are. The herbs didn't work because this isn't a sickness. It's a poison. And this is the only thing that will stop it." The main conflict, it was not man against witch, it was truth against belief. It was a jar of black liquid against a lifetime of fear. Gideon looked at his son. A faint, rattling breath escaped Thomas's blue lips. He was fading. The elder's faith was absolute, but his love for his son was human. He was trapped between his God and his child. You drink it," he whispered, his voice trembling. "If you are true, you drink it first." This was the test, the ordeal. Seraphina did not hesitate. She uncorked the heavy jar. The metallic, ozone smell filled the room. She raised it to her lips, and in front of the elder, his wife, and the dying, she took a long, deep swallow of the black, bitter antidote. She lowered the jar, her eyes locked on Gideon's. She stood, trembling but defiant. "Now," she gasped, the liquid burning a cold path to her stomach. "We wait." The room fell into a terrifying silence. The only sounds were the shallow breathing of the sick and the quiet, agonizing sobs of Miriam. The main conflict was not a battle, it was a vigil. Seraphina had wagered her life, and now, the fate of the entire holler rested on the unseen war happening in her veins, and on the faith of a broken man. Time stretched. An hour passed. Then 2. Seraphina stood, her legs weak, but she did not fall. The dizziness had come and gone, just as it had in the cave. She was alive. Gideon watched her. He watched her every breath. He saw her shiver, saw her clutch the altar for support, and then saw her stand tall again. He saw not a witch, not a demon, but a girl covered in the earth who had not died. Then he looked at his son. Thomas's breathing was now so shallow, it was imperceptible. He was lost. "He's gone," Miriam whispered, a final, hollow sound of grief. She buried her face in the cot. "No," Seraphina said. She stepped forward. Gideon did not raise the candlestick. She knelt by the boy. His eyes were closed, his skin like wax. "Miriam, hold his head up," Seraphina commanded. Her voice was no longer pleading. It was the voice of a healer. Miriam looked at her, her eyes dead. "Hold his head up. Now." Numbly, Miriam obeyed, lifting her son's limp head. Seraphina uncorked the jar. She dipped her fingers into the black antidote. She pried open the boy's jaw and wiped the liquid onto his tongue. She did it again and again, forcing the drops past his lips, massaging his throat, willing him to swallow. "What have you done?" Gideon whispered, stepping forward. I have done what I can, Seraphina said, sitting back on her heels. The rest is him. They waited. The silence in the room was a living thing, a predator. And then Thomas coughed. It was not a rattling, wet sound. It was a dry, violent, choking cough. His body arched, his eyes flying open, unseeing. He coughed again, a deep, racking sound, as his body tried to expel the poison. Miriam gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. He's breathing, Seraphina said, her own body slumping with a relief so profound it was almost painful. He's fighting. The resolution had begun. It was not a flash of light. It was a cough in a dark room. For the next 3 days, the meeting house was a battlefield. Seraphina did not leave. Gideon, his face a new, humbled mask, did not leave. They worked side by side. The holler, hearing the news, did not come with torches. They came with the sick. One by one, Seraphina and Gideon administered the antidote. Seraphina, with her knowledge of the dosage. Gideon, with his voice, his authority, convincing the terrified families to allow this, quote, witch's brew to touch their lips. It was a terrible, painful cure. It forced the body to purge the metal. It brought vomiting, and fever, and night sweats. But it worked. The rattling in the lungs receded. The shadow lifted. Color returned to pale faces. On the 4th day, Thomas, the elder son, sat up and asked for water. Clear, clean water, which Seraphina had to stop Gideon from fetching from the well. No, she said, her voice raw with exhaustion. The well is still poison. This was the second part of the resolution. The cure was not enough. They had to stop the source. She led Gideon, Hiram, and Jeb, now her shame-faced, awestruck protectors, back to the cove. Not down the goat path, but through her tunnel, into the root cellar. She took them to the collapsed mine shaft. Here, she said, shining a lantern into the dark, wet hole, this is the wound. Gideon looked at the shaft, then at the cove, now visible in the gray morning light. He saw it not as a place of curses, but as a place of sacrifice. Elspeth, she knew, he murmured. She knew, Seraphina affirmed. She tried to warn the elders then, 40 years ago. They called her a witch. They cast her out, just as you did me. She lived on the ridge, alone, studying, trying to find a way, not just to cure, but to fix. Gideon's face crumpled. The full weight of his and his father's catastrophic pride fell on him. We turned her into a monster, to hide our own sin, our ignorance. She hid the antidote, Seraphina said, because she knew you weren't ready for the truth. She hid it, and it cost her life. The resolution was complete. It was not just the saving of lives, but the unburdening of a soul, the town's and Elspeth's. That day, the men of Hemlock's Notch, led by Elder Gideon, did not go to church. They brought their picks, their shovels, and their dynamite. They did not just seal the breach, they obliterated the tunnel, bringing down tons of granite and earth, forever separating the poison of the cove from the water of the holler. They built a wall of stone, and on it, Gideon himself with a chisel carved a new name, not Forbidden Cove. He carved Elspeth's Rest. 1 year later, the holler of Hemlock's Notch was not the same. The fear, the one that had hung in the air thicker than the fog, was gone. It had been replaced by something quieter and stronger, gratitude and memory. Seraphina stood on the ridge, but not alone. Thomas, the elder son, now a strapping, healthy lad of 17, stood with her. He was her apprentice. He was not learning the names of herbs or how to set a bone. He was learning to look, to observe. He carried a ledger, just as Elspeth had, and was dutifully sketching the leaf of a ginseng plant. You think she'd be proud? Thomas asked, not looking up from his work. Seraphina looked down at the holler. Her cabin was still on the edge of the settlement, but it was no longer an outcast's hovel. It was the healer's home. The path to her door was well worn. I think, Seraphina said, a small smile touching her lips, she would be relieved that we stopped being fools. The epilogue of the story was written not in dramatic acts, but in simple, profound changes. Elder Gideon, humbled, now preached a different sermon, one of humility, of listening to the world God made, and of honoring the wisdom of those like Elspeth who had been cast out. The witch was gone. In her place was Seraphina, the healer. She was still the Yarb doctor, but she was also something more. She was the keeper of the truth. She taught them how to test the water. She taught them to read the signs of the earth. She never returned to the cove. Its purpose was served. The stone wall stood as a monument, a reminder of the price of ignorance. Sometimes, at night, she would take out her grandmother's journal. She had not yet plumbed its depths. Elspeth had catalogued plants and minerals Seraphina had never heard of, properties of light and soil that still sounded like magic. It was not a book of cures, it was a book of questions. Seraphina closed the journal. She was no longer haunted by her grandmother's last words. She understood them. What's buried there? Let it lie. Elspeth hadn't been warning her away from a curse. She had been protecting a truth the world was not ready for. She was protecting the cove from the holler, and the holler from itself. The brand of witch had been burned away by a truth that was colder and stranger than any superstition. Seraphina had descended into the forbidden darkness, her only hope a secret from a dead woman, and she had emerged, not with magic, but with knowledge. And in the isolated, fog-draped hollows of Appalachia, that was the most powerful and the most dangerous thing of all. The past is not a dead thing, it is a buried thing. It whispers in the names of our towns, in the warnings we give our children, and in the fears we cannot explain. Here at Old World Whispers, we believe in digging. We believe that stories like Seraphina's, stories of courage and truth, and the terrible cost of ignorance, are all around us. They are waiting in the fog. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more tales of the quiet, unbreakable strength that built this country, please consider subscribing to our channel, Old World Whispers. Your support allows us to keep these histories and these voices alive. Click that bell so you never miss a new chapter from our American past. We are so grateful to have you here. Until next time.